Oh, hey, it's me, David Robertson.
And it's me, Christopher Cotter.
And it's us, the Religious Studies Project. And it's you, the listener.
And we're well into 2018 now, and time is ticking away. And we've got an interview from someone you haven't heard in quite some time. It's Thomas J. Coleman III, speaking with Ingela Visuri on autism, religion, and imagination. Fantastic conglomeration of topics there. Really looking forward to hearing this.
Indeed. Take it away, Tommy.
Welcome to the Religious Studies Project. My name is Thomas Coleman, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with a doctoral student at Sodertorn University and Gavle University, Miss Ingela Visuri, who is conducting some fascinating multi-method research, which I suspect is going to change the way cognitive science of religion conceptualizes the relationship between individuals on the autism spectrum and belief, or lack thereof, in supernatural agents. Ingela, welcome to the Religious Studies Project.
Thanks, Tommy. I'm so happy to be here.
Good. I was hoping you could start by telling us briefly about how your research began, and then we will jump straight into some general questions and end with a more detailed account of your current research.
Right. So I was always very interested in empathy and role-taking while I was at university doing my basic courses. And after graduating, I started working in schools teaching religious education, which is a non-confessional subject here in Sweden. And by coincidence, I was recruited to this special educational department with pupils who are on the autism spectrum. And at that time, it was just called Asperger's syndrome, which is high-functioning autism. And I had a pupil there at this department who was a member of a Pentecostal congregation. And he used to ask me questions about glossolalia, and he didn't really understand why he didn't speak in tongues. And also he had teachers who were religious, and they had told him that God used to speak to them and told them a lot of different things. So one day this pupil said that, sometimes I think that God might be talking to everyone else but me. And for me, this was the moment when my research actually began, because I immediately came to think of theories about how people use their empathy to communicate with invisible agents. And this was before I was acquainted with the cognitive science of religion. Mm-hmm. But already in the 50s, in social psychology, there were such discussions, which I knew about. So I decided first to write a master thesis trying to explore how individuals who do have autism, but also have religion or spirituality in their lives, how does communication work for them with these invisible agents? And this was how I slipped into the cognitive field, discovering that there were a lot of interesting theories that could be useful.
Wow. Very cool. So you had mentioned, of course, specifically the autism spectrum, or I think we'll call it the autism spectrum continuum. What is that for our listeners? I wondered if you could give us a brief description.
I would say that autism is a different type of cognition, and it's really a collection of symptoms. So, for instance, there are difficulties in the intuitive understanding of social communication, and there's also unusual sensory processing in individuals with autism. And just to exemplify, people who don't have autism are typically unaware of automatically responding to social cues that are really subtle, such as reading facial expressions or interpreting the intonation when speaking to people, or drawing information from body language. But for autistic people, this doesn't happen intuitively or automatically. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to understand that people who are high functioning and autistic, they are able to compensate by using their intelligence and verbal ability. So they may learn how to do it, but it takes a lot of effort because these responses are not automated.
Gotcha. So what I kind of summarizing here, if I understand correctly, that individuals on the spectrum aren't lacking cognitions per se, but they go about thinking about the world and particularly maybe other people in a little bit different way than we neurotypicals might, your average person.
Exactly. And I also think it's important in autism studies, there's an ongoing debate on the role of sensory perception. And I think this has been very much overlooked in the cognitive science of religion when we're discussing autism. And so, for instance, autistic people, they might be hypo or hypersensitive to different social input. And this differs a lot between people, and it also differs between senses. It can fluctuate. And there also seems to be difficulties in the synchronization of multimodal input. And I think this is also crucial when we're trying to understand how autistic people experience the world.
An example of multimodal input would be, I guess, like listening to someone, watching them as they're speaking as well, just to give some examples.
Exactly. So watching a movie, for instance, would be a multimodal experience, while reading a book is a unimodal experience.
Now, why have cognitive scientists of religion been interested in individuals on the spectrum?
Well, cognitive researchers who depart from what is called the naturalness hypothesis of religion, they have expected that social abilities such as mind reading or theory of mind, as it's also called at times, that this is what underpins belief in superhuman agents. So to figure out what gods or ghosts or ancestors want, you need to sort of think of their minds in a similar way as when you're thinking about agency in just any person, right? But since autism is a case of mind reading difficulties, a number of scholars have expected that autistic people, they may not be able at all to mentalize with or believe in invisible agents. But for me, it was a little bit different because I had this teaching experience. And I couldn't really see any difference in my different classrooms because I was teaching autistic pupils certain days and non-autistic pupils on other days. And I couldn't really see any difference between how many religious or spiritual pupils there would be in these groups or how many were, really disinterested or atheistically oriented. So what I did was that I decided to turn the question around. And I wanted to explore how individuals who do experience difficulties in social communication, why do they still engage in invisible relations, right? Why do they keep on reading invisible minds if mind reading would be so difficult for them, right? So this was a starting point for the PhD thesis that I'm now working on.
Fascinating. So you had some suspicions that maybe the current state of the field in CSR as it related to the autism spectrum might be incomplete, and was hoping, I guess, then we could get into how some of your research perhaps challenges and informs some of this past theory, and I guess we'll add there hasn't been much work done on individuals on the spectrum within cognitive science of religion. So.
Right. And the previous research has been quantitative, and it's hypotheses that people are testing on large groups. But I decided to design an explorative study using mixed methods. And I'm also aiming to work a little bit like an anthropologist, because I think that all new fields of research, we need this phase before we move on to testing hypotheses, right? We need to explore the field. And what I'm doing is that I'm using my participants as experts because I'm not autistic, right? So I can never experience the world from an autistic perspective. So I need them to help me get insights into what's happening. So for instance, I let them prepare their own interviews. And this is to minimize my own impact on the material. And also when I'm formulating my hypotheses, I discuss with both my participants, but also other people that I know that are on the spectrum, if they think that this makes sense to them. Because if it doesn't make sense to them, then it's probably not right.
Right.
And my findings so far is that my participants in this study, they do really think of their preferred superhuman agents in relational terms. So there seems to be a lot of mind reading going on in terms of thinking why these agents cause certain things to happen, or what these agents think of one's behavior. Like, is this a good thing to do? Is it a bad thing to do? And then you would feel what God wants, for instance.
And so I was hoping you could also maybe discuss some of the narratives that your participants have shared with you, and how do they relate or contrast with previous theory?
So, yeah, I have an example from my participant who calls himself John. And he calls himself a spiritual Christian. And when I asked him if there was a specific starting point for his current view of life, he told me, this is a quote from the interview, right? Mm-hmm. I think it has developed because it kind of happened a couple of times that if I did something that felt morally right or something, then I felt like I got quite happy and I was energized, and it kind of felt like the world was more with me. It's like something agreed with what I did and said, that's good, gave me a pat on the shoulder and kind of, you did something right. And that, I think, developed into me doing something according to God. Mm-hmm. And I think this is also an interesting example because it begins with an emotion, an experience, and that develops into what he perceives to be God.
Fascinating. So how then does some of this research perhaps pose new questions for the field here to follow up on with more anthropological, ethnographical research, as well as quantitative and perhaps experimental?
Well, I think, to begin with, I would like to challenge this previous supposition that we need intuitive mentalizing skills for interpreting superhuman agents. And I actually think that when autistic people get rid of bodies, it helps mentalizing, because you have both the automated quick responses, right? And then you have the slower, more reflective responses. And despite lacking the intuitive responses, they use their reflected mentalizing skills to think of what these agents want. And it helps that they don't have any facial expressions, they don't have any body language, they don't need to interpret any intonation. And there's also emotional coherence in invisible agents that you don't get in ordinary people.
How so?
Well, people who are non-autistic, we are quite good at hiding our emotions.
I have to disagree. No, just kidding.
Yeah.
Well, of course.
If you spend time with autistic people, you'll notice that they are very straightforward and they tell you what's going on. Wow. Which also gets them into trouble because we're not expected to be that straightforward. We're expected to be, lying a little bit here and there. But these kind of lies in terms of body language are really confusing for autistic people. So if I'm really annoyed with you, for instance, I still want you to like me. So I'm trying to hide that I'm annoyed and I'm still smiling and trying to behave as...
Is that what is going on here? No, just kidding.
No, come in. But for autistic people, they're able to feel what other people feel, but it's difficult to understand what other people are thinking. So this discrepancy between emotional and cognitive input is really confusing. This is also something you get rid of in superhuman agents that are bodiless.
And so is it almost like a limiting of distractions, perhaps, that bodiless agents perhaps make it easier, I think maybe you're suggesting, to interact with? Exactly,
I think. And I'm not suggesting that autistic people would be more or less religious. That's not my point. But what my study shows is that the people who have both autism and religion or spirituality in their lives For them, it seems to be easier to think of minds when you don't have any bodies. That messes up communication. And it's pretty much the same if you're communicating with a friend over the internet. Mm-hmm. It's easier because you don't have the body, right? And also you have a lot of time to think about what the other person means. And you also have time to formulate a proper response. But you don't get that in real life interaction because it's quite fast and quick because we're expecting people to have these intuitive skills.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry to interrupt the episode, but we just wanted to let you know, to remind you about our Patreon link. The Religious Studies Project has always been free since its inception, but we know that there's a great problem in academia with people not being paid for the work that they're expected to do, particularly early career scholars. And we at the RSP want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So you can help if you can spare even £1 a month by going to patreon.com/projectrs and subscribing. We know that these podcasts are very useful for people that are teaching and people in their learning. So if you can help either by subscribing there or by making a one-off donation using the PayPal button on our website, it'd be greatly appreciated and will help us keep bringing you this podcast for free and fight against exploitation in academia. But now, back to the episode.
And many people on the spectrum actually prefer kind of remote or internet type communication. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
I guess precisely because it's lacking some of the more maybe embodied features that we use on an everyday basis to understand other people. Exactly.
And I was actually asking, this is an example of my anthropological method, if you would call it that. I was hanging out in a sofa one day in one of these schools because I've been spending a lot of time with my participants and other pupils in their schools. And I noticed that autistic people, they're generally in Sweden, they're really good at speaking English. And I asked a group of pupils, like, how come that autistic people seem to be so much better at speaking English? And one guy, he said that, for us, it's so much easier to interact with people online. And therefore we become gamers. And gamers interact in English. And that's why we become better, right?
Now, how does this open up perhaps some new directions for researching religion and non-religion and neurotypicals? Because as I understand, it's your work primarily concerns individuals on the spectrum, but it also, of course, has implications for people who are not on the spectrum.
Yes. So first, when it comes to mentalizing, cognitive research on mentalizing, I think it's important to think of that as a complex construct. It's like a toolbox with different instruments that we can use in different manners. So first, we have this difference between fast and intuitive processes that I've been talking a lot about, and the slow and reflective processing.
Right.
And then there's also the difference between emotional and cognitive empathy. So we sort of have to elaborate with all these different mentalizing aspects.
Could I ask for an example between cognitive and more emotional empathy for our listeners? How are the two different there?
Yeah, I mean, the emotional empathy is feeling what other people are feeling. So, for instance, if someone is sad, you would become affected by that sadness, right? But the cognitive empathy is more in the head, so to speak. This is like, so for instance, if you're nodding, you would know that someone's still listening to you, or you just get these little cues. So, or someone's frowning, for instance, and then you can interpret that this is an emotional response going on, but it's more on a cognitive level.
Gotcha. All right. And so then how does this distinction relate to individuals on the spectrum and off the spectrum and belief in supernatural agents?
Well, I think, and my point is that this is for both autistic and non-autistic individuals. I think that we need to acknowledge that people use reflected thinking a lot more than has been expected in the cognitive science of religion. For instance, non-autistic people might have intuitions about supernatural agency. But if you're living in Sweden, for instance, it's not the norm to be religious.
Right.
We have a rather secular norm. So that means that you might discard your intuitions and set for, another explanation. But also in autistic people, I don't really see that it should affect them so much that these intuitive responses are not there, because they use these slow processes instead.
Yeah, so they're not lacking the intuitive, certainly, but perhaps they're a little bit different, and then therefore they rely more on reflective type thinking. And as I understand this, you've also crept into some interesting avenues with your research having to do with fantasy. I think you touched on earlier, and imagination. I was wondering if you could further kind of elucidate how those might play into religiosity or non-religiosity for those individuals on the spectrum.
Well, something that surprised me in my results was that the majority of my autistic participants turned out to be fantasy prone. Okay. And some of these fantasy prone people, they're gamers, and some of them love fantasy fiction. But what's common for all of them is that they switch between different realities. So they have the empirical reality, which is quite fragmented and difficult and exhausting. And then they create their own imaginary realities, which they switch into. And I suspect this is a kind of coping mechanism. Okay. So they create, with the help of their imagination, really interesting worlds that they fill with characters that might be influenced from religion, spirituality, but also fantasy fiction and popular culture. It could even be artists, pop stars, for instance. And they have these worlds and they interact with all these characters in a sense that reminds a lot about how cognitive research describes interaction with superhuman agents.
Really? Okay.
So I think this is something that we need to look into, that if mentalizing is used and it's a non-human agent, I think that's equivalent to the study of gods and spirits and ancestors, which is more traditional. And I also think this is, it's relevant for younger generations. Mm-hmm. This is something really interesting to look into.
I know on the Religious Studies Project, we usually pride ourselves in challenging traditional conceptualizations of the category of religion and, of course, supernatural agents as well. And what I'm hearing is some of your work does just that, as well as perhaps cognitive science and of religion in general. I think we can certainly expect it to open up some exciting new avenues for religious agents as they are traditionally understood, and perhaps maybe the magic of Harry Potter or massive multiplayer online gaming and all these other type fantastical imaginative agents that people seem to engage with on a daily basis, I suppose, but perhaps don't think of as religious or spiritual.
I totally agree with you. And for instance, one of my participants who describes himself as Christian, he also says that he's totally into Harry Potter, for instance. And until he was 14 years old, he literally believed that there were unicorns. And now when he's older, he says that, well, I don't believe in them in the ontological sense anymore. But they're still, with me, and I fantasize a lot about them. And when I'm fantasizing, it becomes real for me. And I think this is also something that we risk missing out on if we have, if we don't do these explorative studies, if we just hold on to scales and questionnaires that have always been used, because many of my participants might describe themselves as, well, it's not that they believe in God and they don't go to church, but they still experience a lot of interesting things, and they interpret that it's spirits or ghosts or even demons, or then you have these like fictional characters as well that they interact with on a daily basis.
Well, yeah, it seems like it even, of course, further challenges the notion of belief, what it means to believe, or whether belief is important, as we often think it is, if there are all these various other imaginative fantasy religious agents that perhaps people wouldn't say they believe in per se, but seem to interact with, engage with, perhaps emotionally, and a number of manners. So very interesting. Just kind of wrapping up here, I was hoping, maybe if you felt we had left anything out of this podcast, or if you had any closing words or some takeaway points for the listeners, anything else you'd like to discuss with us today about your research or the field.
I think I would like to return to your previous comment. And I think that when we're researching belief, it's very easy to end up in these ontological categories. It's like a statement. Is it true? Is it not? It's like a number of things that you need to hold on to or reject. Mm-hmm. But this is not interesting for the people that I have interviewed. They start from their own experience. And I think the body is important here, that, you feel you have a sensed presence of a ghost, for instance. And these sensed presences, then they turn into some kind of notion of what's going on and invisible agency. Right. Yeah. But they don't depart from, thinking, is it true or is it not that there are ghosts? Because it's not interesting for them, because they experience them. Mm-hmm. So I think that experience is a really interesting analytical category that we could use a lot more in the cognitive science of religion. Awesome. I think that's a good note to end on. So, Ingela Visuri, thank you very much for joining us today on the Religious Studies Project. Thanks, Tommy. I want to remind our listeners, be sure to check out some of the previous podcasts that are closely related to today's topic. I'll include some links in the description, such as interviews with Dr. Will Gervais on God's Mind, Your Mind, and Theory of Mind, and also with Dr. Stuart Guthrie on religion as anthropomorphism. So thank you all for listening.
Thanks to Tommy and Angela there. Really fascinating topic and, quite personal for me, given that I am the father of an autistic child. But I don't think he'll be turning out to be religious in my household, I'll tell you that.
What is religion? Oh, we could get into that. This is a topic that exercises us quite often in the Bow Bar in Edinburgh. Not just regarding children specifically, of course. Next week, we've got an interview that Hans van Agen recorded with Chris Ransford on God and mathematics, which is another excellent topic. We're very used to that sort of science and religion construct, but we've not really had it in conversation with mathematics before. So again, looking forward to that. A nice barrage of interviews.
I can see that can go in a lot of different directions. I mean, it immediately makes me think of for the Freemasons, the God as the great geometer. So, the geometric ordering of the universe is the idea of God, at least in certain schools of that. So yeah, it's going to be fascinating.
Exactly. Do keep coming back for our Opportunities Digest that Ella Buck has stepped ably into the editing helm of. Thanks so much to Ella for taking on that role. Thanks also to our 18 patrons on Patreon, creeping up slowly. Still hoping to hit that 100 mark, but thanks so much to all of you who have subscribed or who've donated using our PayPal options on the website, or indeed who continue to do your capitalistic endeavors through our amazon.com.co.uk and .ca links. It really does make a big difference.
Absolutely. We're getting to the point now where we're able to start making some very positive changes. We're seeing the way that we can produce episodes and the way that we can reimburse people for the effort they're putting into is really improving all the time. And that's down to you guys. But we can go further. We can do more. So please do consider helping.
Exactly. I had an interaction on Twitter last week with someone who pointed out the slight irony of us attempting to tap cash-strapped academics for cash to pay cash-strapped academics. So that was quite a useful pointer. But we appreciate that many of our listeners will also be in the position of being potentially exploited by the system. So don't put yourselves out. But if you've managed to maybe rise slightly up the ladder a little bit, remember back in the day when you were and right up to the top levels, of course, everyone still does a lot of work for free.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we're thinking more about, if you've used our podcast in teaching, you've set it as a reading, you've given it to the class as an exercise or something. Be great if you could give something back.
But enough of the guilt trip for now. Keep coming back, keep listening, and come back next week for Hands.
Thanks for listening.
The Religious Studies Project is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions. The RSP is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, SCIO, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation, charity number SCO 47750.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and our managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Jonathan Tuckett, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bogg. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio editing by Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, and sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop.
Don't forget you can support the project by using our amazon.com.co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes and other portals.